Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Katy McCormick, and I'm an associate professor in the School of Image Arts, which is affiliated with this student and faculty-run gallery known as ArtSpace, and you'll see it shortly. We're here at 401 Richmond in downtown Toronto. I was lucky enough to work with Rachel Rozanski, who studied in our documentary media program between 2018 and 2020. Her exhibition, PERMA, was selected as a feature exhibition in the Toronto Contact Photography Festival in May 2021. And we're really pleased to be able to present it here today to the public, both online and in person this week. Before getting started, I would like to give the land acknowledgement. Toronto is in the dish with one spoon territory. The dish with one spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans and all newcomers, have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. We also acknowledge that the City of Toronto, within which we meet, is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. I would also like to acknowledge that I am an immigrant settler in this land. I am an artist and educator employed by a downtown university whose namesake is the architect of the residential schools, known to systematically subject children to violence, abuse, and even death, as demonstrated by the horrific discovery of 315 children's bodies in unmarked graves in Kamloops, BC recently. My Indigenous colleagues and students have provided guidance in the way forward and asked that my university change its name as a means of denouncing the history of violence and erasure of Indigenous peoples from this land. I look to them for guidance, and I respectfully support their struggles against colonialism, racism, and genocide. I would now like to introduce Rachel Rozanski, an artist I esteem, who I knew first as a student and now as a fellow artist, and I congratulate her on her exhibition, PERMA, currently installed here at ArtSpace Platform Gallery. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you, Katy. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and thanks for having me. I'm coming from the traditional lands of the Hunkaminam speaking peoples at the moment, but I'd also like to acknowledge the territories that for thousands of years have been traveled, used, and honored by the Inuvialuit, Gwich'in, Dene, and Trundek Gwich'in. These people are the stewards of the land where I was able to live and work and thrive while making this project. I recognize that as a white settler who's always lived and worked on these and other colonized lands, it's my responsibility to actively work towards decolonization in all areas of my life. As an artist, especially working with environmental topics, it's important for me to first and foremost recognize Indigenous ethics, research, and oral histories, and to give back to the Inuit who generously informed this project by sharing their land-based research and traditional knowledge.
Thanks, Rachel. I thought before we begin our discussion, since I am in the space and there is a phenomenological dimension to seeing work in the space, I thought I would take you for a spin. And I'm being literal here. I have my computer on a table with wheels. So I want to just show you around the gallery to give you a brief sense of the work that's here. That's really very extraordinary. And I'm going to just get out of the way and move my chair out of the way so that you can behold this extraordinary work of art. Oops, without the chair, hopefully. Which Rachel will tell us about. It's a giant drawing made with charcoal. And it's not the first thing that we see in the space. Actually, the first thing we see in the space is another drawing. And we see this drawing from the door. So as soon as we walk in, we sort of recognize that we're in another realm. When we look down the gallery wall, we see a darkened space. And in that darkened space, we see a video at the very end of the gallery, which I'll get closer to. We see several light boxes. And Rachel will tell you about the content of these light boxes. And then we see small light panels with scans that, again, Rachel could give us more detail about. And then we are immersed in a video installation where there are, in fact, two screens playing upon one another. And there's a sound element that's very compelling, although you can't hear it right now. You'll have to come in or go online to hear it. And finally, at the other end of the space, we have another magnificent drawing. So altogether, these works form a kind of constellation that we're going to be discussing this evening. So I will pull up my chair again, and I will begin with some questions for Rachel. And we do want to open it up for you this evening. If people have questions, you can put them in the chat, and we'll be trying to get to them as well. So I thought maybe I'd begin by asking Rachel to talk about her practice. It's kind of a two-part question, Rachel. First, can you talk a bit about the evolution of your art practice? There's nothing casual about a giant drawing. It speaks of a long-standing drawing practice and a dedication and a level of skill. So what led you to this kind of multidisciplinary approach where we're seeing video, sound, scanograms, and then perhaps as a second part to the question, you could talk about why this approach was, in fact, the best way to deal with the subjects found in PERMA, the dynamics in environmental land change and extinctions.
Sure. So now I pick my medium based on what I think the subject matter would suit best. But I've been drawing for a very long time. So that was my default for a while. And I guess I should first explain that the overarching theme of my work has been visualizing living in the Anthropocene, which is our current geological period where human activity is the biggest influence on climate and the environment. But I need to clarify that when I talk about that human activity, bringing on the Anthropocene, I'm talking about the global expansion of European colonialism. And that's what led to environments being fundamentally transformed. So then I'm asking myself, what's the best medium for what I'm trying to do? At first, I did feel like it was drawing. And I'm just going to share with you a few images of some of my earlier work. This is a body of work I started in Iceland. That was my first sort of project in the north. And I was at a residency in Skagastrand, which is on the northern coast. So what I was doing there was exploring around the beaches and grassy fields through town because these violent windstorms would carry things ashore and inland all the time. And I started to find all these tide pools full of decomposing birds and other animals. And over days, I'd watch them disintegrate into these similar sort of collections of remains and plastics and other things attached. And these became totally obscure conglomerates that were mixtures of all these things. So I would draw those. And part of the reason I was in Skagastrand is that there was a research station there looking at chemical disturbances causing mutations and deaths in mollusks, fish, and birds. So a lot of the samples I was working from were collected when I was with them, and we would collect a lot of samples or things I would find on my own as well. But there was only a few hours of daylight each day, so I would take photos. I would go out and take a lot of photos, and I always thought of photography as a tool, but it ended up being actually the main way for me to collect images to work from. So I was doing all of this these drawings in the style of scientific illustration, because there's a history of idealized representation in that. So we kind of expect it to be a documentation of things in their most quote unquote perfect form. And so even though these things that I was drawing look surreal, they aren't. This is one example for you of the things I was drawing and the reference object. And yeah, so this was something I found again and again every time I went to the north, was these birds that would carry things in them and disintegrate for all different reasons. But a lot of research around that was happening in Viopol, and then again later when I was in Nunavut. So even though these drawings were effective, they could only do so much, and people didn't necessarily understand that these were representational. And that's fine, but I also wanted to be able to always use the right medium for what I wanted it to do. And throughout this residency, I was really using photography a lot to document things. And it's what I've always come back to as, I think, my favorite tool to collect things, to hoard images and information. And it's something I wanted to explore more. So I will just briefly say that when I started my master's program at the university, it was because of a lot of the loss of land I'd seen previously in Nunavut, which I'll just jump ahead to. On the Canada C3 expedition in 2017, I was an artist in residence from Cambridge Bay to Ecological, and we were looking at a lot of environmental reactions to change happening there. So that left me wanting to make this project that became PERMA, and because along the coast I was seeing all this degradation and just massive amounts of land being lost, and nobody was making anything about it that I could find. So the reason I decided to do my master's in documentary media was because I thought this was too hard to explain in any still imagery, drawing or photography, and I felt that I needed video. So when I was in Toronto and I was beginning the program, I was living on the Portlands, which is someplace you're not allowed to live. It was once Ontario's largest wetland, and then it became the largest dump. So now it's sort of an industrialized area, but they're talking about revitalizing and quote unquote naturalizing the Portlands, which is a way of gentrifying it. But it was really interesting to me living there, because I started finding all these strange things. And the first thing I noticed was the smell of dead animals was always around. So I started going on walks, sort of following the smell. And it was just almost everywhere I walked, there were dead things under my feet. And so this is where I became really interested in land and how to take images of land. Because this earth, the revitalizing process, quote unquote, is basically taking off a few feet of the earth, moving it to a dump, and covering it up with fresh earth. So I felt that photography wasn't enough in this case, because I wanted direct contact with the earth, with the things being moved, replaced, covered up, whatever. And so I modified a scanner to make it portable. And I would take it with me because I wanted a direct impression of the earth and the things that I was finding there. Now, when it came to the PERMA project, I especially wanted to be able to do that because this earth is so active and alive. And you can see that in video, but you can't really in still imagery. So I realized I needed to make this a video project because it's oozing, dripping, it's active. And that, to me, could only be shown through video.
Thanks, Rachel. And of course, I recall those wonderful images from your Portland's project. It was really a delight to see that process unfolding as you were preparing for your major project. And as you say, you know, this sort of naturalized space is really the result of a kind of colonial capitalist practice of development. Kind of ironic, or terribly ironic in many ways, that we have to essentially introduce the kind of naturalized process for places that have more or less been damaged extensively in order to really be in that space and possess that. I want to turn to your space of choice, this huge area of Canada. I think you told us that over half of the land mass in this country is permafrost. And you know, this notion of the North is something that we live with. We have a kind of mythology or an idea of this sort of great white North, a snow-covered land, you know, as far as the eye can see, and of course polar bears floating around on icebergs. That's the image that we see constantly in articles about, you know, global warming, climate change. Your work presents a wholly other kind of landscape. Why, or maybe speak to how you came to this representation of spaces, as you said, this dripping, you know, black kind of mucky, dynamic image of a land that, you know, kind of possessed a certain idea in our minds.
Yeah, imagery of the Arctic has been really interesting to explore because it is so selective. And I experienced some of that surprise when I first went to Nunavut, because the collection of images we see of the Arctic, like you said, typically look a certain way. And that only shows us a very small window of its reality. And it's part of that is the fantasy that we want to uphold. But it's also used as a symbol, and it's used as a tool in a lot of ways. For environmental movements, for example, as the final frontier, the saving the planet, things like that. So I was interested in this place as an image, as an idea, and versus the actual place. So photographs and video always make up a collection of images that represent an environment visually. But it's especially true of places like the Arctic that most of us never get to see firsthand. So part of that is because so much about the Arctic has been politicized, but documentary media especially has played such an important role in picturing the world and shaping our consciousness and our understanding of the current environmental crisis, and scientific aspects of that as well. So I think a lot of people have been surprised to see this video, and even some colleagues and teachers and peers have said there isn't enough snow and ice, and it doesn't look like the Arctic. Where's the Arctic? And that's how strong that image is in our minds, which is so interesting. And by our minds, I do especially mean white people in the South, but I think it's important to be aware of that and how the imagery we're being fed makes real things happen. And one example of that is in the film Angry Nook by Althea Arnakok-Baril, because this film shows us how powerful that imagery can be, because one environmental organization brought on the EU ban on seal products, and by swaying votes. So with that strong imagery is how they did that, and they created a narrative about an environment, and they eliminated a sustainable economic practice that Inuit depended on. So yeah, how in the Anthropocene, basically how we imagine the environment helps determine the reality of it and how we exist in it. And this romanticization of nature, and especially of nature in the Arctic, creates separation from it. And that's shown in all these different ways. But it also causes huge issues in how decisions about the North are made in the South.
Thanks. That's a great response. I think the other sort of really powerful aspect, and I've now got the projection behind me, which is constantly changing. And I'm sorry, with the laptop camera, it doesn't give the same intensity. But I'm wondering, just in terms of thinking about your process, how important research was to you, given the realities of what is happening. And I guess if you think about discovery and research on the one hand, there's always this notion of collaboration on the other. And thinking about maybe the methodology that was driving your work. Research, collaboration, moving into spaces that were not your own, that you were not familiar with, but that you were really intrigued by and concerned about. You had learned a lot about environmental pollutants in earlier projects. So I wonder if you can unpack a little bit some of this, the way methodology works, kind of both in terms of discovery and research and in terms of collaboration and relying on those who live on the land and know the land in different ways.
Right. Well, after my time in Iceland, when I was in Nunavut on the C3 expedition, there was some really interesting research happening there, because traditional knowledge and science were trying to come together and understand these recent changes. And there was a lot of back and forth, and all of the knowledge was shared and published, and it was just a very different way of researching from what I had ever understood or seen, and really exciting. And it's something I think a lot of places are starting to try and do. I don't know how many are successful, but it's one of the reasons I chose to go where I did. So watching researchers navigate this was really interesting, because they're coming from totally different research paradigms and methodologies. But yeah, a lot of the people on the expedition were Inuit who had grown up where we were traveling. So they were our only source of information really on the past and how the Earth had looked and the environmental changes there. And so we were gathering information between all those places, and I got to help with that process a little. But that made me want to really explore this interdisciplinary research more. And I wanted to do that partly through some of the institutions that are in the Yukon and Northwest Territories that are trying to do that. But also there's community-based monitoring programs in Tuktoyaktuk, for example. So it was something I was trying to do, but anyway, the main part of my research is my artistic and experiential research. So going to the place and working with what I find, noticing connections, going in search of things. Going in search of things rather than saying, I'm going to study this and learn this. Just learning through exploring and making and listening and having a sort of relationship of my own with the land that I'm studying. I wanted, I think also the scientific research and information I gathered, I had to work to not let that completely dominate my own research, but because I had so much information, I was reading papers for like a year before I went to those locations. I was speaking to Canada's permafrost researchers over the phone, and I was connecting with scientists at the Yukon Research Center ahead of time as well. So that's how I found all of the locations I was going to go to look for slumps. But then luckily I also had a lot of time there, so I got to do my own research. And then, of course, probably the main part of research for my paper and that guided my own understanding of what was going on was Indigenous land-based research. So the intergenerational oral knowledge and study of that land and all the interconnected changes, because that's some of the people I spoke to, which I'll talk more about later, really educated me on how permafrost affects every aspect of that environment, because they've been living on that land for thousands of years.
Your reference to land-based practices is clearly a key component, very, very important. And I wonder, because my own sense of your work is that it's almost like the land is speaking to us, that you have managed to capture this dynamic process that I would never see. And thus I'm sort of privileged to witness, even if this process is a negative process, it is a kind of, it's almost like there's a kind of voice or agency in the land that is being communicated in the work. This really kind of got me thinking about the way that, both historic and contemporary landscape practices have a tendency to kind of present like a totalizing view, often shot from above, sort of God's eye view, whether from just a high point on a mountain or an aerial perspective. And I feel as if in your work, I'm kind of low to the ground. There's still this kind of hovering, but I'm not standing as this vertical being. I'm sort of moving over as if I'm a bird or a fly. We're very close sometimes, just above the grasses. It feels very grounded to me, literally close to the earth. So this close proximity and close attention to the dynamic aspects of the land and the ground itself really is an impactful aspect of your work. So I guess I'd like to hear you talk a bit about how you situate yourself in the landscape and sort of where the place of the human is in this landscape. Does the human even matter in these views? Like, I almost feel like we don't, it's not about us, it's about the earth.
Well, I settled on that way of showing it when I went there. I was there for a few months by myself at an artist residency at the Klondike Institute of Art and Culture. And while I was there, I was completely alone, and there was nobody else at the residency. I spent days just talking to myself. So I wonder if that actually sort of led into that way of showing it, because I spent all my time like that, close to the ground, scanning, moving, close to the earth. And I just wanted to show that kind of experience of walking around and seeing this thing that's happening everywhere. But I think we're always aware of the filmmaker. Things like camera shake might make it more obvious, but because the camera operator, Priyam Banafsha, used a Steadicam, it was very smooth. And my main goal was to get as close to the earth as possible. And like my scans. And that would have been absolutely nauseating if it were shaky at all. So that was just, to me, the best way of doing that. But I also, I wanted to show the land and the water as best I could in that active melting earth without having like a voiceover, one voice to the whole, speaking to the whole thing, or Yeah, and I mean, of course, it's my interpretation of the experience, but I see my drawings more as the place where myself and my body are inserted into the landscape, because that's my direct impression, Mark making my interpretation. Yeah.
Wonderful. So, Rachel, although I've tried to show what is here, I wonder if you would like to show some of the images so that people can better view. You have a series of core samples. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about those. And then you have scans, again, different aspects of kind of where you were.
Yeah, I'll just share my screen. So just to give you a brief explanation, about half of Canada is permafrost, and in the last 10 years, this thawing permafrost and slumps have started to really change the Arctic landscape, and it's a relatively new concern. And the permafrost is the foundation for Arctic ecosystems, and it normally stays frozen throughout the year. Here you can see the image on the right. These are core samples. The one on the right is mostly compressed peat, but this is permafrost because it's held together by ice. And on the left is mostly ice. So they can be all different makeup, but when they thaw, they could drop 20 or more feet, and it contains all sorts of heavy metals, gases, fossils, and preserved organic material, and especially huge stores of CO2. So I took these scans at the Yukon Research Center, where they have core samples from around the Yukon, and I used the portable scanner to make these. And with this extremely shallow depth of field, I like how they end up looking sort of abstract or microscopic. They also they start melting onto the scanner because it takes so long to make the scan. So I could only take out one at a time and then quickly scan it, and they put it back in the freezer. I originally wanted to drive up the Dempster Highway through Inuvialuit, Gwich'in, Dene, and Trondheim traditional territories to document all of these slumps happening, because that's one of the places that it's happening the most quickly. And when it does, it becomes a really fine mud-like silt that can act like quicksand. So you can take a step, and then the next step, I would go in almost to my waist. It really does act a lot like quicksand. So when I went to Whitehorse after the residency, I started working with the scientists at the Yukon Research Center. And I connected with them ahead of time, but they really helped me find all these locations, and they're doing a lot of community-based monitoring programs. And then after that, Parnan Benefsha met me, and we drove up the Dempster Highway to Tuktoyaktuk. And then I went back the following winter as well to shoot more video. And all of these areas that I'm talking about have some of the world's oldest permafrost at 740,000 years. And in some places it's around 1,600 feet thick. So you can imagine when it thaws, it would collapse a huge amount. And the silt that comes out of it is draining into waterways. So that was part of the focus of my video, was on waterways. And so much gas is released that I could smell it. So before I would even see a mine or a slump, I'd often smell methane, which is, you know, one of the easier things to smell, coming out of it, like a cow farm. And I was interested in looking at climate change induced slumps, but also by permafrost degradation caused directly by infrastructure or industry, like placer mining, which is the images you can see on the right. These were also these land cavities that left behind thousands of years worth of history, and they'd slowly transform and leave behind these sort of land ghosts, these shapes of what they were. So these are hydraulic mines, which I will show you in the video later. but they were the most direct way for me to see permafrost besides as core samples, because it was melted and changed every day, because they would use a big hose basically to melt the earth. So every day it was extremely active, and these massive boulders would be falling out of the sort of cave ceilings. And yeah, so in areas like the Klondike, it's really common to find permafrost rich in minerals and fossils and gases, and I would find plenty of all of those, as well as quite a few fossils.
Rachel, just a quick question. Is that gold mining, or what is the...
Yes, that is gold mining, but these also are, of course, full of quartz. Usually with a gold mine, there is a lot of quartz. So yeah, I thought it was interesting to put placer mining alongside video of slumps without really defining the two, because the spaces that are mined in slumping look more or less the same. So in my drawings, I was really able to look at these spaces and isolate what's left behind in them and the materials that were taken out. So these are some more scan images of, besides the ones I took at the research center, I would go to slumps and mines and take pieces of permafrost that had fallen from the ceiling, and I would scan them right there as they melted, because as they were these little sort of ice boulders that would separate from the land mass and melt really, really quickly. And I was really surprised how easy it was to find exposed ground ice, because once it's exposed and it starts melting, it kind of gets covered with mud. So finding fresh ground ice means it just recently eroded more, or a fresh slump happened. Yeah, I'll just go back here. This was a crack forming around a wide slump. This is one of the world's widest slumps. It's just one corner of it, and it's growing each year, and these cracks sort of form where it's going to break off next. So it stays active for years. It's been here since, 2016. So it's slippery, it's unstable, and it's really hard to make accurate predictions about how fast it's thawing based on the past, because it's never happened before. Could we just play the video now?
And I just also want to suggest, if people have questions, to please go ahead and put them in the chat, and we will pose them to Rachel. So please don't be shy. Rachel, yes, I was gonna beg that you show us some videos so people can get a sense of that.
That'll be Maria.
She's having difficulty. Maybe, do you want to try to launch it?
Oh, she says it's showing.
Oh.
All right.
Okay, so hopefully people can see that. We can't see it.
So I'll start by talking about the, well, I think what you're seeing right now is the mine. I can't see it, but that's the placer mine, where the hydraulic mining is happening. So it's basically a big hose spraying water. And, oh, sorry, okay. Going back. First, I'll talk about the research center a bit. I mostly used papers to find slumps in the field plateau, but unfortunately I also found lots and lots of newer ones as well. And so I would go between that and Google Maps on satellite, looking around for the spots that there might be a slump for when I was driving by. Maria, could you just jump ahead to 11:30? Okay, so here you can see the hydraulic theme. This was at a gold mine in just outside of Dawson City. And then could you jump ahead to 1308? So I'm going to talk about some of the changes happening in Tuktoyaktuk, which is one of the many communities that are really affected by permafrost thaw, but especially I think Tuktoyaktuk is probably the first town that's going to have to be completely relocated because of it, and this land could easily be gone in 50 years. So already a lot of the land that has houses and infrastructure is gone, and as someone who's been researching this and speaking with scientists for a while, I have some background knowledge of the topic, but I was an outsider coming to the north, so I wanted to learn from people living there, especially about their experience seeing land change and how it's managed and researched. So one of the people I spoke to a lot there was Sarah Adam, who's an elder that lives in one of the homes that will hopefully be moved before the land beneath it thaws into the ocean, which is already happening. The corner of her house is hanging off the edge. And the last house she lived in is already underwater because it was further along, closer to the beach. And the timeline prediction surveyors and researchers gave them was very, very inaccurate. So because they reacted so slowly, they may not be able to move it at all. And thawing permafrost also compromised the town's drinking water, and it now has heavy metals, for example, seeping out of the permafrost and into the water, like mercury. So something I've been trying to work through in this project was this idea of human imagination as an ecological force, which is thinking about if humans have the greatest impact on the planet's systems, is the way we look at those systems or nature affecting how nature looks? And then does it affect the way research is done? And it certainly has in history. So I was researching how the Western imaginary of nature could influence what ecosystems end up looking like. This can be through land alteration or pollution, but also by confining and constructing nature out of ecology, by choosing if and where it exists, what species survive or die, what landscapes look like, and how all these things are used. Because Western environmentalism is based on the concept that humans are and have to be separate from nature if it's going to stay intact. But this also shows up in environmentalism science, but indigenous research methodologies exist outside of this because humans don't have to be separate from nature. That doesn't make sense, and you can't necessarily separate that. So this is one of the reasons I was interested in how institutions approach collaborative work with northern communities, because developing ways of looking at and representing ecology is a really important part of any discussion around the Anthropocene. which is basically the renaming of the current geological period as the age of humans. But it often ends up becoming shown as the story where humans are the protagonist and everything else is kind of in the background, which is another way that nature continues to become further separated from everything else. So that's just a bit on my research. We don't have a ton of time left, so I guess I'll just open it to questions now, unless Katie, do you have anything to add?
I think it would be great if we can take questions, if there are any. Maybe Maria, you can let us know if we've had any. So here's a question. These images are fascinating and would make a great lesson for my 7th grade students. It's a comment. That's from Andrea. Thank you, Andrea. I so agree. So I'm going to turn that into a question. How can we get these images in front of 7th graders? Actually, there's more. I'll back up and give the mic to. There's another question for Chloe. Anyway, quickly, can we get this in front of 7th graders? And if so, how and when? We need a resource book. Obviously, we can see the images on your website. Are there other things that you're thinking about doing that can inform young people about these issues?
You know, Andrea, let's talk. I'll give you my email. I'm just starting to show this work, so I would like it to travel around for sure. And I'm not set on anything yet.
That's great. And Andrea, I'll just let you know, I had Rachel come in and speak to an undergraduate class of mine, and they all spoke about the way in which the work brought a completely different image of the North to them, something they had never recognized, and it got them all thinking. I mean, my gosh, to think about half the land that constitutes this country melting into first mud and then ocean, it's really hard to wrap our heads around. So but there's lessons there. It doesn't have to be a kind of frightening piece of information if we can be proactive and think differently about it. So there is a question from Chloe. I'm going to jump over. From Chloe, what have you learned from your practice and from this project in particular, Rachel?
Ooh. Well, I learned a lot from this project. First of all, don't bring a Steadicam to the Arctic. No, it turned out okay, but it was really hard to do, and I think it was probably the hardest project I've ever had to do by far. I would say I learned a lot about collaboration and about knowledge, actually, about questioning everything I've learned and where I learned it, why I know it to be true, and how to acquire knowledge in different ways.
Thank you. Thanks, Rachel. Marnie has a question about your methodology. First, she says, incredible work, Rachel. Can you discuss your methodology regarding decisions on pairings of imagery across the 2 channels? How you went about thinking about that pairing?
Sure. Well, in the beginning, and if you want to watch the whole video, it's on the ryersonartspace.com/PERMA. You can view it on YouTube. So in the beginning, I'm showing the 2 layers of the Earth. I'm showing the tundra and underneath it the permafrost. So that's what I was trying to do at a few different points. But then at others, it's contrasting different. Actually, at most points, it's the different layers of the Earth or 2 sides of what's happening.
Great. Sorry, I was just trying to type that URL into the chat. I'll work on that next. There's another question from Ravenna, and Ravenna writes, "What role does the aesthetic have in this highly researched project? How does a concern with, say, beauty help us understand the situation of climate change?" Great question, Ravenna. Thanks.
Yeah, that was a really big concern of mine because I'm sure we've all seen some environmental projects that were, so beautiful they were romanticized, and that's something I'm trying to avoid, and I hope I'm avoiding. But I don't know. It's there's so many things that I'm uncertain of, but I think the main thing I wanted to do was get really close to the earth to avoid that sort of separation and distance and romanticization, because even if it looks pretty, the camera's steady and the colors are correct and all of that, I wanted to give that feeling of closeness to the earth, and I just thought that was the best way to do it, to connect with the subject and not have that sort of separation.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always this struggle to, we don't want to trivialize or over aestheticize, but I'll just say, Rachel, thinking back to those first sort of critique sessions where you showed us video, I think our jaws dropped when we saw this, this dripping, like powerfully visceral, dynamic change happening as you stood there with your video camera. And it was beautiful, but it was frightening. It was strange. It kind of had this very, obviously, earthly kind of sound to it, but also the drip of time passing and of something changing that's out of our control. And I have to say, in being in the gallery here, and your drawings, of course, are extremely beautiful, but they're also strange and kind of frightening as well. So I think as a viewer, I would say you seem to have found a way to balance the sort of making strange, which obviously not just photography, but other media do, making things that are familiar strange in a way that makes us look at them deeply. And that is part of the power of the work. But of course, there is beauty. These core samples, these scans, they are aesthetically beautiful. I mean, I want to move in, I want to see, I want to understand what they are, but I also just stand there and find the beauty in these images. So I'll give you the last word. We're just about 3 minutes away, but I guess maybe just a final thought in, what do you want us to take away? And maybe that's an unfair question, but what do you want us to take away from this work?
Well, I'm hoping that at the bare minimum, a better understanding of permafrost, because I think even that topic is so under talked about, because we hear all the time about melting ice, polar bears, all these things, but half of Canada is permafrost, and that land is literally thawing away. So that's the number one thing I wanted to show, but also just sort of challenging what you think you might know about in environmental topics, and the way we see the environment around us, and where those ideas come from. Okay, Whoops.
I think you succeed at that. I really do. And I think that continues to be a notion that we'll struggle with for a very long time. I guess just finally, you know, to underline the irony and the horror, in a way, the violence of these impacts being so extreme in places that are, you know, thought to be so pristine and thought to be natural, and of course that are largely occupied by indigenous peoples. And it is here in these places in the north where the greatest impacts are occurring, and where it is right up against, you know, the lives of people. And we here in the South, you know, kind of talk about, wow, it's so warm in October, or this November is so warm, it's great. We don't really recognize the degree to which our Earth is changing. Many of us are really beginning to, and want to have some hand in making it a better world, and actually addressing these issues. And I think your work starts to get us on the path to thinking about these things. So I thank you, Rachel. It's a beautiful show. As I said at the beginning, I will be here this week. We have our space here in 401. You can email me if you're interested in coming in to see the show, and just let me know, and we will welcome you here to the gallery just over the next few days. So I'd like to thank the director of ArtSpace platform, Joshua Vetavilu. Thank you, Joshua, so much for all your help. Maria Barr, our tech person, thank you so much. And lastly, but certainly not least, Rachel, thank you for joining us this evening and speaking so eloquently about your work and teaching us about things that tend to be a bit invisible.
Thank you, Katie and Josh and Maria and everyone for coming.
Yeah, it's our pleasure. You all again, please check our archive, and do check the gallery for updates on our programming, and have a great